So look, the talk was originally with Nadia going first, but I'm just going to skip through her slides and then we will go back. One of the real purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate the potential of really wonderful collaborative relationships between the Brain and Mind Centre, the Sydney Children's Hospital Network, and many of the different faculties within the university, and the real potential of these collaborations to transform mental health care, whether it's the assessment or the treatment or the response to children and families with neurodevelopmental disorders. When Nadia talks, she's really going to demonstrate the value of things like the CP register and how they've transformed the assessment and treatment of cerebral palsy. And where I'm starting here is to highlight that most single disorders are highly comorbid. In fact, if a child is diagnosed with one neurodevelopmental disorder, they're more than 80% likely to be diagnosed with another neurodevelopmental disorder. And this has led to a real shift in psychiatry, both in neurodevelopment and other areas, focusing on dimensional models of assessment and care, as opposed to categorical assessments where comorbidity is the norm. So what we've done essentially is, in the first couple of years of the Child Development and Mental Health team, is we've established the world's first neurodevelopmental research register that operates across Sydney, Sydney Children's Hospital Network, and really Australia. And Kelsey Boulton has been leading this work. And we started really by asking, how could we use assessments in a way in clinics across the country which were clinically useful, but also provided wonderful research data on neurodevelopmental disorders, really so that we can develop a database that researchers, clinicians, and also governments can use to base their policy decisions upon. And what we did is we surveyed really clinics that see thousands and thousands of children with different neurodevelopmental disorders, asking them about what their needs were and what assessments were required that probably weren't being picked up in their existing clinical practices. And we came up with a common set of tools that included standard neurodiagnostic assessments, but also transdiagnostic ones that really tapped into the needs of the children and families. And this research register has now been operating in the Sydney Children's Hospital Network in multiple clinics, autism, gender dysphoria and the like, ADHD, and it's also been taken up by researchers all across the country. So we've got UQ, Melbourne, Perth participating in the research register in this minimum data set of collection. And what I wanted to highlight is the research register, even though it's been operating for about 6 months now, and we've had about 800 kids in one clinic go through that register, it's now enabling clinicians, students and researchers alike to ask different research questions of the data that's being collected in a clinically meaningful way. So we've already had a lot of publications demonstrating high collaboration as a result of having this broad research register. One of the things it also has enabled us to do is to start studying the value of biomarkers in a sort of a dimensional approach. And we've been able to look at the role of heart rate variability, GABA spectroscopy, and we've got a whole range of other biomarkers that we're linking in with this register to be able to answer questions really around what are the differences between cohorts, how do they relate to symptom severity, and most importantly, how do they relate to functional changes for the child and family. It's also enabled us to ask really novel questions about what different assessments might we be able to do to transform the healthcare process. So this is a repository of data that we have at the Brain and Mind Centre. 600 children have been assessed for social delay in this 360-degree camera view, 4K observational assessment. And we are looking at joint attention and eye-to-eye gaze across all of these children. And what we're wanting to do is to move away from assessments that rely on clinicians learning assessments that take many, many thousands of dollars, many weeks, families many, many thousands of dollars, and to see if we can automate some of this assessment in a way which is much easier for families and services. And we've partnered with the engineering department, and in particular, Alistair and Carter have provided some wonderful tools that we can use to tap into things like motor movements and joint attention, and to start to think about how that interacts with social synchrony and whether we can start to detect social delay automatically through videos. And in fact, some of the initial data that we've produced and is preparing for submissions for publication demonstrates that we can, through automated coding and deep learning methods, differentiate between autism and control and predict symptoms of severity. And we're working on those codes at the moment. And it's enabled lots of researchers to participate. So we're looking at voice recognition, we're looking at facial recognition and movement. And it's an open repository that we have, which is open for collaboration across the university. One of the things that's also enabled us to do is to start to try and study relationships with areas which are known to be associated with symptoms and believed to contribute in some way to presentation. So for the last 5 years, we've been very focused on the role of the immune function and potentially how it relates to and associates with autism symptom severity. And potentially how it might be associated with the development of autism. And we've published some of the key studies in the field over the last couple of years with Ian Massey and Shrujna Patel. And more importantly, we've then asked the question, well, look, we're getting these interesting associations, but what can we do to try and improve the diagnosis, detection or treatment for these disorders? And we've partnered with Ralph Nahn, who has this wonderful ultrasound image analysis programs to look at different organ integrity in the ultrasound at 3 months of fetus age. And what we've been able to do, we first looked at the thymus because of its relationship to immune function. And we found that in 40 kids with autism that there weren't differences between those with and without autism at the fetal scan. But more recently, we've looked at the thalamus and vermis, and Ralph, who's leading this work with his team, has shown that we can actually differentiate on that sample of 40. So now we're using the research register to go back and track large numbers of kids coming through the developmental clinics to see if we can differentiate between those with developmental difficulties, social delay, attentional difficulties, and some of these very early markers of organ integrity in fetal scans. Our team has also been leading the work around integrating circuit-based models with clinical practice. So, circuit-based models are fascinating, and how they apply to clinical treatments like social learning therapies is sometimes quite unclear. And we've tried to provide unifying models to integrate clinical practices with these circuit-based models. And we've proposed different models for how we might support circuits through the use of oxytocin. We know that oxytocin, for example, is core for social behaviour. I won't go through the different studies around that, but simply to say that we're using these models now to detect early biomarkers of therapeutic response to oxytocin, and we've proposed multiple models around oxytocin delivery in children with autism. Really to try and understand the biomechanics of oxytocin, we've now developed in a phase 1 trial, an oxytocin ligand that track where it goes in the brain and body upon delivery. And we're working with ANSTO and UQ to do the phase 1 trial next year. And that's really going to answer how does oxytocin actually alter the, circuits in the body and the brain to improve social function. And it's the first of its kind in the world. And it really can only be done in a couple of locations. And because of our partnership at the Brain and Mind Centre with ANSTO, it puts us in quite a unique position. And this is really important because we've shown that oxytocin actually, as a first medical intervention that might improve social impairments in autism. In a recent trial, we've just completed a much larger one, shows this effect is likely to be in the younger children. And now we're combining this work with the Cerebral Palsy Alliance to track social delay from the very first 3 months of life up to 2 years. So we're using some of our biological methods we've developed as well as our observational coding to track if we can identify those kids with cerebral palsy who develop social delay later in life. And that's estimated in this cohort to be about 30% of the population. So I'm just going to move back now to Nadia. I'm sorry, Nadia, to take your prime time spot. I hope I haven't taken up too much time. But I hope that demonstrates really the value of multidisciplinary research and the potential to change practice in the community.
Yeah, thank you. And look, I think that leads quite well into the fact I work at the Cerebral Palsy Alliance, the research institute at BMC. And I'd like to give you a little overview of the things that we've achieved to date and why we are very excited to really start collaborating more with all of you. And we hope that we can stimulate you to join us, because childhood conditions, the neurodevelopmental ones, of course, you all know that they really are a huge lot of conditions which are interrelated, and they have a huge burden on children with them and their families and the community. And really, there hasn't been a very concerted effort to do research in the area, partly because they're complicated. You can see even in cerebral palsy, look at the overlap with all the other neurodevelopmental conditions. And if you look at the diagram on the right from our International Cerebral Palsy Genomics Consortium, which we started, this is a paper that we published in Nature Genetics with our colleagues. And we have Jana Wilson, who's working with us, leading a lot of this work in Australia. Just look at the genetic overlap in the different conditions. And you saw, I mean, I was fascinated to hear John Kwok's talk. And I just wondered how many of those genes that cause dementia are also associated with childhood neurodevelopmental conditions. So as you can see, this is our research. It's a program. And there's 25 of us sitting in Brain and Mind. We're in the nursing building, so please reach out to us. And our research ranges from the prevention, finding the causes, all the way through to policy, advocacy, strategy. And what I think is good about our program is that it has been informed by people with cerebral palsy and their parents, who were surveyed by two of my colleagues, Sarah McIntyre and Iona, and also researchers. And they said, this is what we want you to do. Because for us, the impact of our research has to matter to people who live with cerebral palsy and their families. Now, our research agenda is by its nature multidisciplinary, and also we work very closely with philanthropists and donors, because honestly, if anyone's depending on NH and MRC for their research funding, it's just not going to be enough. The other thing we're very keen about is nurturing the career of early people who are starting their careers, PhD students, postdocs, early career researchers. It's really been part of our agenda. Now, we're privileged to host the Australian Cerebral Palsy Register, and you can see from this, as we're so proud to see that the rate of cerebral palsy has dropped by 30% in Australia, and it is now the lowest reported rate in the world. But not only has it dropped, it's also children who have cerebral palsy are now more likely to walk and talk, so they have less severe CP, less likely to have epilepsy, and less likely to have neurodevelopmental, to have intellectual disability. Next slide, thank you. And I'll just give you a little taster of some of the things we've done. The prevention of cerebral palsy has been multifactorial, but this is just a beautiful example of something that went from basic science all the way through to knowledge translation and implementation, which we were part of. And magnesium sulfate given to a mother who's going into preterm labor reduces the risk of cerebral palsy by 30% in her preterm child. So overall, it will be associated with about a 15% of reduction in cerebral palsy nationally. But there are many other strategies. Next slide. And when we're looking now at a rate that's dropping, we are starting to look at rarer but more preventable causes. And one of the important factors that's highlighted by my colleague, Dr. Hayley Smithers-Sheedy, was that cytomegalovirus. And we all know that a lot of neurodevelopmental conditions are associated with infection or have been attributed to it. So she's launched a social media campaign to prevent transmission of cytomegalovirus in utero. And now it's gone out, there's a national campaign to train midwives. And if that works, she's going to launch it globally. Next slide. Now, as Adam mentioned, that both autism and cerebral palsy, unfortunately, are diagnosed very late, which means that we're missing the time of maximal brain growth to actually help. An adult has a stroke, everybody knows, they get treated, they start active intervention. Unfortunately, for children with cerebral palsy, it's been late diagnosis. So we have now launched with our colleagues around Australia an early diagnosis methodology called the General Movements Assessment. This is a physio in my unit, Michelle. She is videoing a baby, and now we can diagnose it 3 months of age. And this is an app, again, that was developed by an OT, who is Alicia Spittle. We have trainers. And the fact that we now can do early diagnosis means that we can do randomized control trials on early intervention. So we now have 8 randomized control trials in Australia, and we're involved with 3 centers of research excellence. 5 years ago, there was nothing like this amount of research. And this is why we're very keen on collaborating with the engineers. So here's Professor Alistair McEwen, Dr. Petra Carlson, and Pete Horsley, and they are part of our assistive technology team, looking to detect cerebral palsy and other disabilities earlier, but also working with them. We want to enhance communication and also improve mobility. Next slide. And I know that the BMC is very keen on starting and is working in regenerative medicine. Over 85% of people with cerebral palsy and their families want us to look into regenerative medicine. And we have a team of Iona Novak and colleagues designing a whole host of studies. And we really would like any of you who are interested, please reach out to us. We really want to get this work going in an even bigger way. Next slide. And we know that we need the help of families, and we need the help of philanthropists and the community. The NDIS has been a huge thing for, of course, people with a disability, but this is a marvelous family, the Shearmans. They lobbied Greg Hunt and the NDIS to increase the number of hours of therapy that a child with cerebral palsy could have. It's a huge increase, up to 250 hours a year. We couldn't have done it, but parents were able to. Next slide. And my last one is that also, because we believe in collaboration, we launched the Australian New Zealand Cerebral Palsy Strategy, and we launched it just as COVID was breaking out. And if you look, you can see this is a national collaboration between all the organizations that support people with disability around Australia, universities, families, people with CP. And the goals from this strategy, I think anyone who works in neurodevelopmental disorders would mirror them. So we are very excited about this opportunity to work with the BMC. We've had some success, and now we think we can amplify it by working with all of you. So thank you.